Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Debbie from NDIS Property Australia, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that highlights, guides, and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. And today we have two special guest speakers from Everhomes, an SDA provider. We've got Dan and Jess. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
Hi. Great to have you. So, Dan, we have had you as a regular guest speaker on our podcast in the past, but Jess, it's the first time today. So welcome and thank you for taking the time out to join us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Debbie. I've been listening to all of your episodes and it's fantastic to see how you're educating investors in the sector.
Fabulous. Yeah, look, there's so much that needs to be understood. And that is why we were really excited to bring you and Dan on board today to talk about something that probably hasn't really been covered on our episodes before, certainly maybe touched on but not covered in detail, and that is the SDA funding from both the participants' perspective and the, I guess, difficulties and the complications for them to get the funding in their plan, but also when an investor has a house and they've got participants moving in, the time delay that can happen with the participants' funding before they actually get paid. So I guess, should we start with the actual funding process for participants? Do you want to sort of walk us through that process and how that actually happens?
Yeah, Dan, you want to walk through that one? I'll take the other side.
Yeah, because the way that we, I guess, work is Jess does a lot of the work with actually obtaining the funding to make the payments from the NDIA. So she's definitely the expert in talking through that. But yeah, I guess more broadly, the SDA funding is, a subsidy for rental payments for eligible properties that meets the minimum design standard for SDA. And as long as a tenant has that SDA funding approved in their NDIS plan, and that's a place they choose to live in and they're living there, then of course that subsidy can be claimed. And I guess that's probably discussed a fair bit, but it's always good to cover it, from the outset that that's the core concept that we're dealing with here. So there's clearly an application process that has to be gone through once someone's under the NDIS, and then that approval or a pre-approval, and then they find a place they want to move into, and that's when the fun stuff starts. So from there, I guess, Jess, did you want to cover the next kind of bit?
Just to add to what Dan has said, so the way that the funding is obtained for SDA is it's what's called a home and living decision. So there is a home and living team in the NDIA that reviews the applications of participants' SDA funding, and they make the decisions, and they make the decisions on multiple things. So they make a decision on what category you are, so whether it's improved livability, high physical support, fully accessible or robust. They make a decision on your dwelling type, which could be house, villa, apartment. And then they also make a decision on how many people you can live with. Each 1, 2, 3, and then there was group homes, but obviously they're phasing out group homes, which is a fantastic decision. So all of these things are attached, and it's really important to understand, is attached to the participant. So if, say, someone is 3-bedroom, high physical support funded, but they want to go and live in a 2-bedroom, high physical support house, they won't be able to access 2-bedroom house funding unless they go through that whole application process or a review process under a change of circumstance to get a new home and living decision, which would be a 2-bedroom house. They can still ask the owner of a property, hey, will you accept my 3-bedroom house package? into your property, and some people will, some people won't, depends on their own situation. Some people will allow a 3-bedroom funded person move into their 2-bedroom house and then say, hey, but to remain here long term, can we gather some evidence that living in a 2-bedroom house is in your best interest? And then reapply saying, hey, here's the evidence. So now let's apply for a 2-bedroom house. That's what they mean when they say the funding can be used flexibly. Or it might be that a 2-bedroom house funded person actually would rather live on their own in a villa. And that's really, I guess, pertinent at the moment in the robust space, because previously a lot of robust participants were wanting 1-bed villa funding because due to their disability, it's just not compatible for co-tenancy. Whereas now we're seeing a situation where 2-bed house funding, which a lot of robust participants were given, is actually higher than 1-bedroom villa funding. And what that's given in the market is a 2-bedroom house funded participant can now apply for any 1-bedroom villa that's out there because they have a funding package that's higher than the 1-bedroom villa amount. The important thing to note in that, though, is if a 2-bedroom house funded person moved into a 1-bedroom villa, they could only ever claim the maximum amount for a 1-bedroom villa. Every dwelling that you move into is actually capped at the enrolment price. So even if a person is funded higher than the enrolled value of the dwelling, you can't actually access that higher funds. You can only ever access what the enrolment price is per participant of that dwelling. But in terms of the participant, it's great news because it means all these 2-bedroom house funded people originally now can cancel all of their appeals for 1-bedroom funding because they can now just go into 1-bedroom funding and their appeals can sit in the space for their care needs. So they would need to get obviously 24/7 care or increased SIL needs from 2-bed house to 1-bed villa. But that's another conversation altogether.
Your knowledge is amazing, but that is probably the most clear and succinct description I've heard of the participants' funding and how it works with the dwelling funding. So thank you so much for that. That is such a great overview of that. Certainly something that
made sense.
Yeah, no, totally did. So, but you brought up a really interesting point that participants with 2-house funding, particularly important if they've got robust, can now apply to live in a villa, a robust 1-tenant villa. But how many villas are we seeing in the market out there being built?
Not a lot.
Yeah.
So we do duplexes and look, we see a mass problem out there where a lot of people, unfortunately, weren't provided with the correct information, which is why this podcast is so very useful to have out there in the market.
Yep.
And they've gone out and built 3-bedroom robust properties,
We've seen a lot of that.
Quite frankly, are never going to be tenanted. And unfortunately, as an SDA provider, we get calls from investors that have built these 3-bed robust properties, and we give them a very realistic view of the market and the tenancy group, and that, I've never seen a 3-bedroom robust funded person in all our years as a provider or in all my years in disability, which is a very long time. I've seen a lot of 2-bedroom, but almost all of them were fighting to go into a 1-bedroom place because their behaviours were not compatible with other co-tenants. So, we're faced in a situation where we have to talk to these people who are sold, a 3-bed robust house and tell them that, look, the likeliness is you'll only get one person in there, which may not make, viable investment sense for the product that they've built.
Of course.
So it's heartbreaking, really, for some of the conversations that we do have to have.
So now, from our understanding, with potentially some minor modifications, people with IL funding can live in a robust house.
They can.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, how would that work from your perspective?
Can I talk to that one?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, look, we've heard this a lot, is that I guess once the new pricing came out, there was talk about, oh, look, all you have to do is change this to an improved livability house. But there are obviously some challenges going on with improved livability funding. One being that it's been foreshadowed, obviously, in the NDIS review that funding may be removed if those recommendations are accepted. Then we have the fact that every single dwelling in the SDA market can accommodate somebody with improved livability funding now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what that means is that they have everything at their disposal, not just a robust dwelling. And often the HBS houses, let's say they're funded 2-resident, HBS houses are more spacious and they have improved accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the fact that you are basically competing with every other dwelling for somebody with improved livability funding, and we're not sure if it's going to stick around. So if you're making a decision on what you're going to build now, I guess you wouldn't be building robust with the idea that you can rely on improved livability moving forward. You would be building it knowing that you're building for someone with robust funding, and potentially someone with improved livability funding can move in there. And, it's still a sizable chunk of people are funded in the market. So I'm not saying it's not viable. It's just I'm saying that in my experience, people with improved livability funding have been choosing to move into the HBS homes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's also a really good reason for that as well. And, that's a whole conversation around aging in place.
Yes.
See a lot of people given improved livability funding at the beginning of their journey, but if they have a degenerative illness, we're looking at, increased mobility needs down the line. So an improved livability funded person in those situations can now go straight into a high physical support house and not have to move again as they degenerate or deteriorate. Is a really, really, important thing to consider, particularly,
Absolutely.
like dementia is a really great example. We see so many clients diagnosed with early dementia that may eventually result in some significant mobility issues. And at standard, they tend to be given improved livability. And, it can be really, really challenging for someone with dementia to move once, let alone multiple times if along their journey. So that's the other thing to consider with robust. It doesn't provide the additional support they may need longer term down their journey.
Absolutely.
However, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Look, I think we're probably getting off topic on that, but I just wanted to add that if there are probably more robust single resident dwellings being developed, and then improved livability dwellings that are available. So potentially the fact that they tend to be single resident might help somebody that has improved livability funding and wants to live by themselves. So it's more maybe focused on the dwelling size than the actual category.
Sure, yeah. So, okay, this is meant to be talking about the funding. So let's go back to, just so our listeners can get a better understanding of if someone does have IL funding in their plan and they do get to a point where they're in a wheelchair now, they need a wheelchair accessible house, which they're fortunately already living in because they're in a HPS. How does that funding review work? What kind of time frames are we looking for that to happen? Because we kind of know what time frames are.
And that's, I call it NDIA time, which is
of the initial application. It can be a few months, but it can be as long as 6 months initially, and then if there's a review process, it goes. But for a review to change the funding,
so they have their support coordinator or relevant representative needs to submit what's called a change of circumstance, and they provide the evidence that goes with that change of circumstance to say, hey, here's the increased needs, here's the OT assessment, here's functional capacity assessment. We actually need to increase the funding here to be able to have choice and control over where we live in the future, or even just so that we stay in place and it can meet our increasing needs. So, but then you've got NDIS time. So it just, the first thing I say to any owners that I'm dealing with for properties is I cannot give you a timeline, because it almost depends on whose desk it lands on, or how many are in the line at that point in time, or how many urgent applications, are at their door at the moment, because, we've seen SDA applications approved in as little as a couple of days, sometimes in really, really urgent circumstances, which are it's very, very rare. But then we've seen others that have taken, up to a year to get across the line. So it's really important. And having worked in the disability advocacy space for so long, I always encourage our families and our support coordinators, to get a really, really good OT that knows what they're talking about when it comes to SDA, and that can write a really, really good report with the evidence, because quite often they'll come back for more. So the NDIS will go, well, here's not enough information on this, so I need more. Or they'll give a different decision because things weren't included that would have tipped it in the other direction. in the assessment. So it's all, which we don't have control over that because a person chooses obviously their own supports. All we can do is kind of lead them in the right direction of how to get a really good outcome. We provide letters of support as well for those applications if needed. So it's a really tricky process, but it does happen.
So it's kind of nearly as hard as getting the funding in the first place to get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's much easier to change a dwelling type than it is your ratio of people you live with. So one of the really big things that has happened with this price review, which a lot of investors will be affected by, is the change in apartment funding, the 2-bed apartment funding and the 2-bed house funding. So what we saw pre-price review was a lot of investors would take on a 2-bed funded apartment person into the house because the funding was slightly higher by only a couple of thousand. So it was actually, they could move into an apartment generally at a high physical support 3-bedroom rate, because remember, going back to that dwelling enrollment price. So if your dwelling enrollment price was $39,000 per participant, you can accept any participant that is funded higher than that. So a fully accessible 2-bedroom apartment was $42,000 at the time. So even though they're fully accessible, when they translate that into a house, they can still claim the $39,000 at the high physical support rate because they're actually funded at fully accessible higher than that in the apartment. So a whole heap of investors accepted these 2-bedroom apartment funded people into their houses because they could claim that maximum amount. Then come the price review, the 2-bed house pricing has almost doubled.
Yes.
But the apartment funding has dropped. So we're all stuck in this position where the investors have gone, great, I've already got my 2-bed funded people, now I'm going to get this 2-bed funded house pricing, when in fact they're not, because they're participants and they're actually funded for an apartment. So we've had to go through a mass appeals with our participants and their support teams to say, hey, you now need to go back. I know before it was fine, funding fit within the realms of what a 3-bed or 2-bed house is, but now you actually have to go back and say change of circumstance and apply to appeal the dwelling type to a house just so that the funding can keep up.
On that, tell me more about the enrolment of a dwelling. And okay, so if you've built a house that has 4 bedrooms, for example, but you only want to enroll it as a 2-bedroom proper 2-tenant house.
Yeah.
What complications are there around that scenario?
Look, I haven't found really any complications. You just go, it does get treated as a brand new enrolment. And at the moment, the enrolment team is adding more and more documents that we need to provide in the enrolment process. So, and there was some big delays at the end of last year with enrolments going well past the 28-day mark. They're getting on top of everything now. They're a great team and they're under a lot of pressure. But with a change of dwelling, you've got to submit everything again as per a normal dwelling enrolment, but then you actually just have to get a new consent form that says the owner consents to enrolling it as this new dwelling type, as a 2-bedroom. And then they will come back and they will ask you, one, what your participants' names are in the house so that they can make sure their packages are updated if they're entitled to higher funding and already living in the house, but it's been capped at that dwelling enrolment price. And then they'll also ask for, what are you going to do with the other rooms? So we'll go back and we'll say, hey, no, these are just going to be used as media rooms, guest rooms, that they're extra lounge rooms for the participants to use at their disposal. But you cannot put anyone else in there, including SIL participants.
Mm-hmm. Yep, got it. Okay. So let's talk more now about the how an investor will actually realistically get their income on a property, given the vagaries, I guess, of the SDA funding and the time lapse in that paid.
Yeah. Feel a bit of like a spare wheel here because Jess obviously deals with this day to day. So look, but obviously I do try to have conversations as much as possible, and we do, to set expectations there, because the thought is, well, I've built this property. It's a fair amount of cash that goes into just building the thing, and then obviously there's a great need for cash flow once that dwelling becomes available, and it can be a really stressful time. So then obviously you've got to move the tenants in, and then the thought is, well, great, I've got them in there. Okay, I can just obtain that funding. But look, the NDIA can really, I mean, God bless them, but they can really be like a bad creditor sometimes. Like, just with some of the inefficiencies that exist, you just can be just waiting for just basic administrative things to be done. And it frustrates everybody, and obviously it frustrates us and every other NDIS provider out there. And I'm sure I can speak for every NDIS or SDA provider when I say that, look, absolutely we try our best. We submit complaints, we escalate and do what we can to get payments, and they do come eventually. But you can almost expect that those first few months that there are going to be some delays in your payment, and then and plan for that. And then it's going to happen at some point down the line as well, is that the payments are chunky. It's not going to be consistently every month. I mean, it does run that way, but if you're an investor that's running on very skint cash, it can be really a stressful experience. And in some cases, people have to sell their houses because they only had 1 month of cash there to pay and nothing, no buffer for if anything went wrong.
Yeah, we are really adamant when we educate our investors that they've got to have that buffer there. They've got to have 6 months of repayments available, because you just don't know when you're going to get your first tenant in, let alone your second, and you don't know how long it's going to take until that money is flowing.
But it is a long-term investment. We're talking 20 years here. So, obviously that first year may be a tough year. If you've built in the right place to have the right kind of design to stand the test of time, then it's going to be good from there, most likely. That we've seen over 100 times that's what happens. But it's just kind of getting through that period that they have to prepare for.
And look, sorry, I was going to take you through, because we're talking about getting the funding and delays. What the actual process is on how that works behind the scenes. So what we do is, now there's an old system, there's a new system. At the moment, there is a transition happening at the NDIS from the My Place provider portal. So that's the online portal where we claim the funds. And then they're moving over into the new PACE system. And that's going to go over 18 months. So a participant has a plan. They've got their SDA funding in their plan. They decide they want to move into this property. The SDA provider will, under the old system put in a quote that says this is how much, 3-bedroom high physical support funding is. So this is what I want you to put on the system. Now, other providers under the NDIS that don't do housing can actually generate their own quotes, or they can generate their own service bookings. And what a service booking is, it's like, I equate it to like the bank account from which we draw the funds. So we have a service booking on our portal to be able to go in and claim that money back to disperse out to our investors. So it's all about that service booking. Now, for a service booking to be created, you need to have a quote approved. So we're submitting those quotes before someone even moves in to, try and get that service booking open and actioned by the time they've actually moved into the property. And this is where the issues happen. So I can create a service booking myself as a provider. However, it won't let me until that quote is approved. So getting those quotes approved administratively by the NDIA can be so delayed. And so we submit it, as well as the support coordinator is submitting those quotes as well and submitting the change of circumstance. And then quite often it will come back. So sometimes it will happen like the same day. Sometimes it will happen a week. We had a worst case scenario where it once took us 7 months to get a service booking through.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And that owner, as you can imagine, was taking that to the media. He was absolutely beside himself. It submitted multiple. He got all of the money back. Like, it did get back paid, but that's the kind of worst case scenario we're dealing with. Haven't seen anything like that previously, and hopefully never again. But absolutely, at least 2 to 3 months, it's usually taking on average. Like, we currently have 34 service bookings that are missing off the system that we are chasing down. And then to add on to that is we'll get the service booking and the quote approved through, and it will be a completely random amount. So it won't be the amount that we actually put on the quote. And so then we'll have to be going back and going, guys, you haven't even funded this appropriately. It's not in line with what the plan says. And so then we'll have to go through a whole process there. And of course, on the back end of this, an investor has the holding costs of the property and the interest rates rising and all of that coming on, and the provider becomes the middleman. But everyone's getting cranky at while we are, doing absolutely everything within our power to get this action. But, the other issue is as a provider, we can't even inquire about a participant without either their consent to share information with the NDIS or whether they're on our portfolio. So until they've ticked that quote and said, yes, you're a provider for this person, they're not going to talk to you about it. Then under the new system, which is PACE, that actually is meant to eliminate service bookings and eliminate quotes. And it's just meant to be put onto the PACE system. It comes up as an endorsed provider. So we are the endorsed provider for that person. They tick it off on their back end, and then we're just meant to be able to claim. However, the difficulties with PACE is we don't see how much funding they've put in there. So on My Place, you could actually see the bank of funding. You could see as it was coming out how much they had left. You could warn the sport coordinator if it was getting to the end of the year, because they only ever put in whatever funds are left for the plan. So if you come in halfway through their plan at 6 months, they will pro-rata the money to the end of their plan. And then it will have to happen again at the end of that plan. There'll have to be another quote and service booking process. So this happens once a year where there's,
Oh, wow. So look, it's really quite complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can we just run through from an investor's perspective? Okay, the house has been constructed. It's been ticked off, certified by the SDA assessor. The house has received, or the dwelling has received, its certificate of occupancy. Then the SDA provider, you guys, who have been engaged by the owner, will then enroll the dwelling.
Yep.
Okay, you've got participants or the first participant lined up to go in. They may take a month for that process to happen and actually get moved in, and any minor modifications that are needed to be done. Then they've moved in. I know that you can't, say that you've got that process of the service booking
or the
quote,
yeah,
and all of that is in and hopefully being done. They're still not going to pay until after the first month is up.
Everything in arrears.
That's right. So best case scenario for someone, they've gotten their certificate of occupancy, they've gotten the property enrolled, which takes 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then a participant moves in, then there's another month. So best case scenario, they've still got 3.5 months before they could possibly receive any income. Is that correct?
I want to say that's
best case scenario.
Best case would be the day of moving in. The service booking is through. We absolutely see that.
Yeah,
where we just, on average, it's 2 to 3 months before all of that administration. But in saying that, they will be receiving the RRC. So you'll still be receiving the tenant's portion of the rent.
Right.
But obviously that's significantly under market rent of the SDA subsidy. So yes, it can happen. And again, it's almost like depends on the desk that it lands on. And if it's an Appendix H one where a family moves in, well, I can almost guarantee you that will take longer than 2 months, because that's a whole nother podcast. That it's the Appendix H. But just be prepared for delays. You could be one of the lucky ones that it happens straight away. But yes, it's more than likely at least have a month up your sleeves. 3 months would be my recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually say to investors, cover 6 months.
Yeah.
Mortgage.
That's wise. Yeah, because you also need to budget for the modifications that may be required to make that dwelling suitable for the person. So
excellent. Well, look, I think that answers sort of, all the topics that I wanted to speak about. But do either of you have any just last minute words that you'd like to leave us with, or last minute thoughts on this whole funding?
Oh, look, once it's all set up, the hardest part is just getting it set up. Once it's all set up and it's on the provided system, it does run really smoothly. Like once a year, you might have a tiny hiccup when that service booking is being renewed, but or when the PACE funding is being renewed. But it should, if PACE works as it should, the new system, it's meant to just keep rolling without any disruption. So, fingers crossed that, that actually works out. It's still in baby stages at the moment. They're still working through the glitches in the system, but in theory, it should actually just roll quite smoothly under the new system. But that will take 18 months from October last year, 18 months for that to fully transition. So,
Okay, so about another 12 months or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, my thing that I guess I would finish on is that SDA is a long-term kind of investment. And obviously that first year might be a bit more challenging, but it should, in theory, move pretty smoothly after that, especially once there's some cash reserves kind of coming in. But most of all, what we're about people. And, this is, and I've said it before, and Jess is fully 100% got the same view, is that we're building homes for people that really need accessible homes. And the NDIA is trying to do the best they can. They're a huge kind of juggernaut of a bureaucracy. But, there are people also that are helping facilitate an internationally kind of leading system that is the NDIS. It's all focused on helping people from a human rights perspective, to meet our sustainable development goals. So, there's a really big picture there. And, I would encourage people to think about it from that perspective. I always do and I always will.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is a long-term thing and you need to just be prepared for that. As you said, that first year can be a little bit tricky, but once you're there, you've got 20 years or another 19 years of great income and giving, a couple of people a beautiful forever home. Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Debbie.
Yeah, Jess and Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward we always love having you on the show, Dan and Jess. We'd love to have you back soon to talk more about SDA funding or SDA providerness.
All things SDA world.
All things SDA from your perspective, because, you do an amazing job looking after a lot of properties around Queensland, and always great to have your take on things. So thank you so much for that, and I hope that our listeners got something out of this episode today. Remember, we've been talking about it a lot lately, future-proofing and having that cash buffer. So, yeah, really useful information. So thanks, guys.
Our pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Debbie.
Okay, and see everyone later.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.